Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Welcome on into your FreightWaves Now Community Spotlight. It's Tuesday, so it's time to check up with the one and only Mary O'Connell. Mary, we've got another familiar face coming back to the pod once again today for their monthly market update. David Spencer is back once again.
Yes, he is. We have none other than our favorite market expert where we sit there. And first of all, I ask him a bajillion and one unhinged questions throughout the years. But we really kind of get a chance to dive into the freight market and what we see happening and then what we see as trends for the rest of the year. We dust off our crystal balls to see what we can look into the future and, what might be coming around the corner for, the freight market that's maybe a little... I'm not going to say it's a very hot take, but we just like to see what could be coming.
Yeah, we're right now in the middle of August, and this is kind of like that precipice point where people are really starting to say, okay, we're nailing down and narrowing down our predictions for what peak season is going to look like for most of us. And it's kind of that hopeful versus not hopeful mindset that can tell you yeah, we're going to survive until 2025. We're dead in the water before Christmas. When we're looking at this, where does he kind of think that things are sitting right now? Are we looking at some hope and maybe some things starting to come back, or are we still now pushing out our predictions for a true recovery until 2025 and then the next 6 months, then the next 6 months?
So the one thing that has remained pretty consistent even throughout this year is that, we'll really return that. We'll see that return to normalcy and kind of that predictability again. We're there, but pretty much 2025 is going to mark the beginning of the new cycle, if you will. But for the rest of peak season this year, it's actually been an interesting twist. So the shippers have finally kind of learned that if they pull forward some of their freight, and maybe, ship some of that peak season stuff a little early and, squeeze some space into their various warehouses, that's actually a slightly more cost effective and less stressful for everyone involved, than trying to get everything done in 2 months or less. Of getting freight moved and everything like that. So, when you're not paying out the nose for transportation costs, you just have to pay for maybe some extra warehouse space. That's where that kind of cost levels out to see, is this really more beneficial to order early and just store it, or to hurry up and throw everything together at the last minute. So there's going to be some peak season, but it's not going to be, anything that really gets crazy after anything. But that being said, there is it's really a lot of it comes down to the consumer and their spending habits. And as we've learned, anything with consumers, where there's a will, there's a way. So they will find a way to buy what they need to buy.
If you're a shipper and you're sitting here right now in the middle of August, pretty much the majority of your spend through the end of the year has already been locked up. And on the other side, the majority of your earnings and your profit is also pretty much locked up throughout the rest of the year, because you have done that forecasting and you've done kind of this assessment, and you're basically sitting where you think that you need to be, and the rest of the year will tell you if you were right or wrong, right? If you're a broker, you're sitting in a space and you're like, man, I'm at the land of opportunity right now. You kind of control your own destiny throughout the rest of the year, because you do have this opportunity to take the fourth quarter and maybe revamp your strategy if what you did in the first 3 quarters of the year didn't really work for you. Or you have the opportunity to double down and say, hey, what we did in the first 3 quarters of the year really did work, and now we can repeat that throughout the rest of 2024. If you're a carrier, you're at this point where it is kind of like sink or swim, right? And you are very, very dependent on what the consumer does and where the market turns. Of those 3, where do you think is the best position to be headed into what could be, again, another just kind of very quiet peak season?
I mean, obviously, it's going to be the best position for the broker. But really, that's where that broker and that 3PL can really kind of come in and say, okay, my carriers need this to survive. My shippers can't go any lower than this. This is they're at their bottom line. They just can't make it. They just can't pay any more. So I think that's where that knowledge and that expertise of being that broker to advocate for both sides, I think that really comes into it. And it really comes down to those relationships. Yeah, sure. You'll always have those brokers that are looking to kind of take advantage of a hot market or take advantage of a shipper willing to pay a bunch and all of that. You'll still have those situations, but those good brokers, those good 3PLs that really do make a point of developing those relationships, now is the time that they're going to come in and say, hey, I have a solution for both of you. And whether that's, proposing using some of their own warehousing space to hold some of their customers' goods before peak season or before the retail season, it's really, really important. And then also, this is where I think the broker has a true advantage, is because different industries have different peak seasons, right? Like obviously retail peak season is one that is pretty large. But you also, for example, agriculture right now is their peak season, and they're pretty slow in retail's peak season. So I think that's where the broker and the 3PL are at a good advantage, is that through a diverse mix of customers, you can have peak seasons basically year round. And so I think that that really sets someone up to be in an advantageous place, is knowing like, okay, we have a lot of retail customers. Okay, so maybe we need to dip our toe into agriculture or produce to see if we can fill up the summer peak season when retail isn't slow, but it's just a little bit slower than if than another time of the year. So it's one of those where really kind of leveraging the fact that you can have a bunch of different shippers is really going to be the most advantageous to that 3PL and freight broker. Whereas it's harder for carriers, because carriers typically, unless you're obviously an enterprise carrier, you can't spread your fleet out to service 10 or 12 shippers effectively with maybe 20 to 30 trucks per shipper. So that's very hard for an individual carrier to do. And obviously shippers, they have their main season that, they really are all steam ahead, go, and that makes up a lot of their revenue. So the broker is really kind of in that unique spot where they can kind of make every season peak season for themselves if they want.
So speaking of seasons, we are, of course, smack in the middle of the 2024 Atlantic hurricane season. So far, we've seen five is E, the fifth letter of the alphabet? Yes, we're at Ernesto right now. We've seen 5 named storms. Only 2 have really brought any type of significant impact to the coastal United States, with Beryl, of course, impacting Texas back in the early parts of the summer. And we saw the last storm that moved through really come through and dump a lot of heavy rain across that southeastern coastline. With that, there was a lot of conversation about, okay, is hurricane season going to be the catalyst that changes the freight market? And we are coming up in just about 3 weeks of the climatological peak of hurricane season. Typically, that second week of September is the busiest when it comes to those actual storms. Do we think that the hope is still kind of permeating the trucking space of saying, yeah, we're really depending on a true national disaster to bring us out of this freight recession? Or if people kind of let that fallacy go a little bit?
So that's an interesting question, because I don't know that anyone would really gung-holy admit saying like, yeah, a natural disaster is really what we need.
I
Like
don't know. I've
just
seen some
really,
crazy things on LinkedIn.
just really devastate an entire part of the country, and that's going to save the trucking market. Like, first of all, if that's what you're hoping for, my guy,
Let's
my
reevaluate
guy.
some priorities here.
Okay. But I think that, it's September and October. Obviously those, better than anyone that that's when a majority of the hurricanes for hurricane season come. And so that's to say that that's not a factor for the trucking market in the next few months is, that's not a thing. But due to the excess capacity in the market, I think it's going to be more of like a regional disruption. At least I hope it's more of a regional disruption. I don't want a massive, we don't need a Hurricane Katrina kind of thing. We do not need total devastation. But with that, we will see increased hurricanes, we'll see flooding, we'll see increased rainfalls, specifically along the southeast and everywhere that hurricanes like to hang out. And so I think it's something that, it is something to take in mind and consider, that when you are working with those carriers or those shippers that do have a strong presence in the southeast or in Florida or in the coastal parts of Texas, I think it's really important to say like, okay, well, we are coming up on hurricane season. So if there's anything that we can pull forward and ship while the weather's still good or before potential flooding happens, I think that would be very important to kind of work with your shippers and carriers to say, hey, even if there's a tropical storm supposed to come, I know that doesn't cause a lot of Floridians to evacuate, but it does cause some flooding that do make roads kind of impassable. So I think if anything you can do to pull forward some of those freights before those tropical storms or hurricanes hit, just kind of get the trucks moving out of the dangerous areas, I think that's going to be really advantageous, because that shipper is still getting product to move. Those carriers aren't having trucks sit and everyone is still keeping freight moving, which is obviously what we want. So I think just keeping a very close eye on it. I don't think it'll be a huge catalyst for the trucking market. At least I hope it's not, because I don't want to see a natural disaster kind of wipe out parts of the Southeast, because that's not really what anybody wants, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Mary, thank you for joining us this morning for the update on Check Call. Where can we go to find you and David Spencer a little bit later on this afternoon?
A little bit later on this afternoon, you can watch the new episode of Check Call today at 2 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. Or if you're more of an audio person, catch the podcast anywhere you catch your podcasts, like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If that's not enough news, actually the episode comes out at 12:30 today Eastern, not 2. The newsletter comes out at 2 p.m. Eastern, and you can subscribe to that on freightwaves.com/checkcall.
All right, Mary, thanks for that. We'll catch up with you later on this afternoon.
Bye, guys.